The dawn over the Philippine Sea on October 25, 1944, did not break with the promise of light, but with the suffocating weight of impending annihilation. The air hung heavy and humid over the water, a thick blanket of tropical moisture that clung to the skin of every sailor on deck, making the simple act of breathing feel like inhaling warm soup. To the east, the sun was trying to claw its way up the horizon, but to the north, the horizon itself was shifting, changing shape, mutating from a flat line of empty ocean into a jagged, chaotic mountain range of steel and fire. This was not a storm front rolling in. This was the Imperial Japanese Navy Center Force, the single most concentrated armada of surface firepower ever assembled in the history of naval warfare, and it was steaming directly into the undefended throat of the American invasion fleet. At the center of this floating apocalypse sat the Yamato, a battleship so obscenely large it defied the logic of buoyancy, a 70,000-ton Leviathan bristling with 18-inch guns that could hurl a shell the weight of a frantic sedan over 26 miles. It was a weapon of terror designed not just to sink ships, but to erase them from existence, and flanking it were the Nagato, the Congo, and the Haruna, followed by lines of heavy cruisers that moved like wolves behind the Alpha Predators. Against this wall of iron stood Taffy 3, a call sign that sounded almost whimsical, a diminutive designation for a collection of ships that were never meant to fight a surface battle. They were escort carriers, retrofitted merchant hulls topped with wooden flight decks that would splinter and burn at the slightest touch of high explosive, carrying planes armed with depth charges for hunting submarines and small rockets for strafing trucks on the beach. Protecting these slow-floating tinderboxes was a screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts, ships so thin-skinned and undergunned they were affectionately and derisively known as tin cans. Among them rode the United States ship Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer bearing the hull number 557. To the Japanese commanders looking through their high-powered binoculars from the pagoda, like bridges of their cruisers, the Johnston did not look like a warship. It looked like a target practice buoy, a frantic insect buzzing in the path of a sledgehammer. The Japanese officers in their pristine white uniforms laughed. They did not see an enemy. They saw a mistake. They saw a navigational error. They believed they had caught the Americans sleeping, and that this pathetic screen of light vessels was nothing more than debris to be swept aside before they proceeded to the real slaughter of the transport ships in Leyte Gulf. The arrogance of the Imperial fleet was not born of foolishness, but of cold, hard mathematics. The Yamato alone displaced more water than the entire American task unit combined. A single armor-piercing shell from a Japanese heavy cruiser weighed more than the engine block of the Johnston. The Japanese gunnery officers did not even bother to load high-explosive shells, which were designed to detonate on impact and shred unarmored targets. Instead, they kept their breeches loaded with armor, piercing rounds ammunition designed to punch through feet of hardened Krupp steel belts, because they simply could not conceive that the Americans would throw unarmored ships into the line of fire. They viewed the Johnston and her sisters not as combatants, but as nuisances beneath the dignity of their main batteries. It was an insult written in caliber and tonnage. The Japanese believed that the mere displacement wave of their battle line would be enough to capsize these American toys. They prepared to sail through Taffy 3 as a gale sails through a spiderweb, expecting the strands to snap and vanish without slowing their momentum for even a second. But on the bridge of the Johnston, standing calm amidst the sudden panic of realized doom, was a man who didn't understand the concept of retreat. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was not a man cut from the cloth of the textbook naval officer. He was a barrel-chested, brooding figure, a man with the blood of Cherokee and Creek warriors running hot in his veins. He had been born in the dust of Oklahoma, raised in poverty, and forged in the prejudice of a segregated America. He had fought his way into the Naval Academy, and he had fought for every scrap of respect he had ever earned. He was not a man who looked at a spreadsheet of tonnage and calculated the odds of survival. He looked at the enemy and calculated the geometry of violence. When he took command of the Johnston at her commissioning ceremony, he had not given his crew a speech about glory or flag or country. He had told them in a low, gravelly voice that vibrated with absolute conviction that this is going to be a fighting ship. He told them that he intended to go in harm's way, and that anyone who did not want to go along had better get off right now. No one had left. And now, as the Japanese battleships began to bracket the horizon with splashes of water taller than the Johnston needs, Mast Ernest Evans did not turn his ship away. He did not lay smoke to cover his own escape. He looked at the impossible armada bearing down on him. He looked at the 18-inch guns of the Yamato, turning slowly to find his range, and he gave an order that violated every doctrine of naval survival. Commander Evans ordered flank speed. He ordered left full rudder. He ordered the Johnston to charge. To understand the insanity of this order, one must understand the anatomy of the machine Evans was commanding. The Fletcher-class destroyer was a marvel of speed and utility, but it was built for a different kind of war. It was designed to screen the fleet from submarines and aircraft, to act as a picket fence, not a battering ram. The hull of the Johnston was plated with steel only 0.5 inches thick, rarely exceeding 0.75 inches, even in critical areas. This wasn't armor. This was skin. It was barely enough to stop heavy machine gun fire, and it offered zero resistance to the naval artillery of a heavy cruiser, let alone a battleship. A sailor inside the Johnston could hear the water rushing past the hull plates just inches from his head. There were no heavy bulkheads to contain a blast, no torpedo blisters to absorb an underwater impact. The ship was essentially 2 high-pressure steam turbines and 4 boilers wrapped in tin foil, carrying enough fuel and munitions to vaporize itself if hit in the wrong spot. To take such a vessel into the teeth of the Japanese center force was like driving a gasoline tanker into a burning building. The primary armament of the Johnston consisted of 5 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns. In the grand lexicon of naval artillery, these were considered pea shooters. They were excellent for shooting down aircraft or suppressing infantry on a beach, but against the belt armor of a heavy cruiser, like the Kumano, which measured nearly 4 inches of hardened steel, a 5-inch shell would simply shatter or bounce off like a pebble thrown at a tank. The Johnston would have to close the distance to within mere thousands of yards just to scratch the paint of the enemy ships, while the Japanese could obliterate the Johnston from 10 miles away. The disparity in reach was absolute. Evans knew that his guns could not sink a battleship. He knew that his shells could not penetrate the citadels of the cruisers. But he also knew that a warship is a complex organism of optics, radar, and command crews. If he could not sink them, he could blind them. He could set their superstructures on fire. He could kill the men on the bridge. He could make them bleed, even if he could not kill them. But Evans had one ace in the hole, one weapon that gave the Johnston a lethal bite if she could get close enough to use it. Amidships between the stacks sat 2 quintuple torpedo launchers loaded with Mark 15 torpedoes. These were 21-inch diameter underwater missiles, each packing nearly 800 pounds of Torpex explosive. A single hit from a Mark 15 could break the keel of a destroyer or cripple a cruiser. But to use them, the Johnston had to be within 10,000 yards of the target. 10,000 yards in a naval battle is point-blank range. It is the distance where gunners can see individual men on the enemy decks. It is the distance where there is no missing. To launch his torpedoes, Evans would have to navigate a gauntlet of incoming fire that would turn the ocean around him into a boiling cauldron of shrapnel and geysers. He would have to drive his unarmored ship through a storm of steel specifically designed to tear him apart, and he would have to do it alone. The crew of the Johnston watched the horizon with a mixture of professional discipline and cold terror. They saw the flashes on the horizon, the distinct yellow-orange bloom of heavy cordite, burning as the Japanese battleships opened fire. They counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The flight time of a heavy shell from that distance was agonizingly long. Then the sound arrived, a freight train roar tearing through the sky, followed by the towering columns of water erupting around the escort carriers they were sworn to protect. The Japanese were finding their range. The colored dye markers used by the Japanese to spot their fall of shot stained the ocean green and purple and yellow, creating a psychedelic seascape of death. The men looked to the bridge, waiting for the order to retreat, waiting for the order to make smoke and hide. Instead, they felt the deck heel over sharply as the ship surged forward. The vibration of the turbines rose from a hum to a scream as the engineers opened the throttles wide. The Johnston did not turn away. She turned directly toward the enemy line. This was the heresy of Ernest Evans. In the rigid hierarchy of naval tactics, the destroyer is a servant. It exists to serve the capital ships, to sacrifice itself if necessary, but never to engage a superior force in a solo duel. Evans was rewriting the book in real time. He was banking on the psychological impact of pure, unadulterated aggression. He knew that the Japanese were rigid, disciplined, and cautious. They expected the Americans to run. By charging them, Evans was introducing chaos into their orderly firing solutions. He was making the Johnston an erratic, unpredictable variable. He ordered the helm to steer a zigzag course, chasing the splashes of the enemy shells. The theory was that a shell never lands in the same hole twice, a gambler's fallacy that Evans turned into a tactical doctrine. He drove the ship like a sports car, throwing the rudder hard over, chasing the geysers of water, counting on the Japanese gunners to overcorrect. Down in the fire rooms and engine rooms, the heat was becoming unbearable. The Black Gang, the snipes who kept the fires burning, were working in temperatures approaching 120 degrees. They couldn't see the battle. They couldn't see the enemy. All they knew was the bell ringing for flank speed and the violent lurching of the ship as it danced through the minefield of falling ordnance. They fed the boilers, watching the steam pressure gauges climb into the red, knowing that if a shell pierced the hull and severed a steam line, they would be boiled alive in seconds. Yet not one man faltered. They trusted the chief. Evans had instilled in them a ferocity that mirrored his own. They were no longer sailors on a tin can. They were warriors on a spear tip thrusting into the heart of the dragon. As the Johnston closed the range, the Japanese gunnery officers hesitated. The sight of a single destroyer charging a battle line of 4 battleships and 8 cruisers was so illogical, so utterly devoid of self-preservation, that for a moment they were paralyzed by confusion. Was this a trap? Was this a decoy leading them into a minefield or a submarine ambush? The sheer audacity of Evans bought him precious minutes. The Japanese heavy cruisers, the Kumano and the Suzuya, shifted their fire from the carriers to the lone destroyer. The water around the Johnston began to boil. 6-inch and 8-inch shells hammered the sea, creating walls of water that washed over the decks, knocking sailors off their feet. Shrapnel pinged off the thin steel hull like hail on a tin roof. The smell of cordite and salt spray mixed with the metallic taste of adrenaline. Evans stood on the fantail, shouting orders through the voice tube, his eyes locked on the leading heavy cruiser. He was closing the distance. 18,000 yards. 15,000 yards. The Johnston's 5-inch guns opened up a rhythmic barking that sent tremors through the ship's frame. They were snapping at the heels of giants. The gun crews worked with robotic precision, hauling 54-pound shells from the hoists, shoving them into the breaches, ramming them home, and firing. They fired so fast that the paint on the gun barrels began to blister and peel. They weren't aiming for the hull. They were aiming for the sensitive eyes of the enemy, the rangefinders, the radar antennas, the bridge windows. Evans was blinding the giant so he could get close enough to stab it in the heart. This was the moment of the crossover, the moment where courage transcends bravery and becomes something darker, something akin to madness. Evans was not just fighting a ship, he was projecting a force of will that rippled across the water. He was telling the Japanese Imperial Navy that despite their armor, despite their massive guns, despite their numbers, they were locked in a cage with him, and he was not the one who was afraid. The Johnston was now sprinting at 30 knots, a white bone of foam in her teeth, closing to within torpedo range. The heavy cruisers loomed like skyscrapers above her, blocking out the sun. The air was thick with tracers. The sea was churning with explosions. And straight into this furnace sailed the tin can sailing on a river of steam and hate, ready to deliver the punchline to the Japanese insult. The mockers had laughed at his lack of armor. Now they would have to deal with his lack of fear. The Johnston plunged toward the enemy line, a dagger aimed at the throat of a giant. The distance was now closing rapidly to under 10,000 yards. This was the moment of truth for the torpedoes. Commander Evans, drenched in sweat and salt spray, gripped the railings on the bridge, knowing that he had to be close enough for the Mark 15 torpedoes to arm correctly and have a high probability of hitting. But the closer he got, the more intense the enemy fire became. The Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano was a wall of steel, massive and unforgiving, and Evans watched the splashes, the geysers, now rising to within mere feet of the destroyer's fragile hull, hearing the shriek of the shells passing overhead, a sound like silk being torn by an impossibly fast, invisible hand. Then a column of water slammed into the port side, lifting the Johnston bodily and spraying the bridge with 1,000 gallons of warm seawater. The ship shook, but held together. Evans was fighting the clock and the geometry of fire. At 9,800 yards, he gave the order. Torpedoes 1 through 5 from the starboard tube were fired at the Kumano, and the launch was not a quiet scientific event, but a sudden, violent physical shock. A thick cloud of black smoke and steam erupting from the tube as the compressed air launched the heavy, deadly cylinders toward the enemy. They hit the water stabilized and began their run toward the massive target at 45 knots. Immediately after the launch, the Japanese response was instant and brutal. The Kumano and her sister ship Suzuya opened a synchronized close-range fire. Shells rained down, and the first direct hit was catastrophic. An 8-inch shell, still loaded with its armor-piercing cap, struck the Johnston just aft of the bridge near the fantail, tearing a hole large enough to drive a small truck through. The engine room reported a terrifying loss of pressure. Power was failing. The 5-inch gun mount number 1 forward of the bridge took a direct hit and ceased to exist, its entire crew instantly vaporized. The bridge immediately lost its gyro compass and steering control, and Commander Evans's first officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, screamed orders into a handheld phone to the main steering unit, buried deep below the waterline in the aft section of the ship. The deck of the Johnston was now a charnel house. Men who had been cheering the torpedo launch moments before were now gone, replaced by smoking holes and twisted metal. The pain was immediate, sharp, and everywhere. The smell was the worst part: ozone-burnt paint blood and the acrid stench of high explosives. Yet through the chaos, Evans did not flinch. He knew he had bought a small window of opportunity. The Japanese cruisers were forced to take evasive action against the incoming torpedoes, and their fire became temporarily disorganized. As the Kumano desperately turned to avoid the spread, 2 of the Mark 15 fish found their mark. The world fractured into a sound of impossible destruction, a deep waterborne concussion that felt less like an explosion and more like the ocean floor itself being ripped open. The torpedoes struck the Kumano's bow and boiler room. The heavy cruiser immediately lost all momentum. Its bow was peeled back like a metallic banana skin, and a massive plume of white steam signaled the destruction of its forward power plant. The Kumano was crippled dead in the water, removed from the fight in one terrible, stunning blow, delivered by a ship the Japanese had scorned as a tin can. The immediate effect on the Japanese command was one of profound disbelief. They had just lost a heavy cruiser to a tiny American destroyer they were supposed to ignore. The shockwave of that single event was perhaps more damaging than the torpedoes themselves. It injected doubt and caution into the mind of Admiral Takeo Kurita, the commander of the center force. He paused. He hesitated. And in that hesitation, Evans bought his struggling carrier task force, the one thing they desperately needed: time. The victory was fleeting, but critical. But Evans, knowing his primary duty, was to the carriers immediately turned the now heavily damaged Johnston back into the heart of the fight. The ship was listing badly, the fire control system was destroyed, and the forward main gun was gone. The only way to fight was through local control, with gunners aiming their 5-inch weapons, manually squinting down the barrels and correcting the fire by eye. The helm was now being manned by a sailor deep below deck. Taking steering orders, shouted down a chain of sweating, terrified men. The Johnston was a crippled, burning wreck, but Evans shoved it back into the teeth of the enemy, laying a thick black wall of smoke across the entire American carrier formation. This smoke, combined with the low visibility of the morning squalls and the sheer chaos of the Kumano's destruction, created a blanket of confusion the Americans desperately exploited. The Yamato, still largely unscathed, emerged from the smoke. Its monstrous 460mm main battery, the greatest guns ever put to sea, finally aiming at a target worthy of its attention, the crippled destroyer. The sheer scale of the Yamato's shells was frightening. The splashes they created were not mere geysers, but minor tidal waves. One of these splashes slammed into the Johnston, washing over the bridge and dousing the remaining functional guns with water, temporarily stunning the crew. But the Johnston was too close. The 18-inch shells were designed to be fired from miles away to pierce thick armor plate after traveling through the upper atmosphere. They were too fast and too robust for close-range firing against such a small, unarmored target. The armor-piercing rounds passed straight through the Johnston's thin hull plates, without exploding, leaving clean, terrible holes that flooded compartments, but did not detonate the massive amounts of explosive within the shell. It was the insult, weaponized against the mockers. Their disdain for American armor meant they used the wrong kind of ammunition to kill them, and that mistake temporarily saved the Johnston from being vaporized. The Johnston, though wounded, continued to lash out. Evans ordered the remaining 4 5-inch guns to target the heavy cruiser Suzuya, which was still maneuverable. The gunners operating in the hellish environment of local control found their mark. They pumped round after round of 5-inch high explosive into the cruiser's bridge and superstructure. Evans knew the shells couldn't penetrate the belt armor, but they were tearing apart the ship's command and control systems, turning the upper decks into a steel butcher shop. The Suzuya was forced to cease fire and began to turn away to address the catastrophic damage to its upper works. This brief duel, a mosquito fighting an elephant, had driven off 2 heavy cruisers and 1 super battleship. Evans had taken the Yamato's full attention, and through a combination of sheer luck and terrifying bravery, had forced the behemoth to maneuver away, losing sight of the vulnerable American carriers in the smoke and confusion. But the fight was far from over. As the Johnston limped away from the duel, a formation of 4 Japanese destroyers led by the heavy cruiser Haguro detached to finish off the American carriers. Evans saw the threat. His ship was a shambles. He had used all of his torpedoes. He had lost his primary gun and was running on one engine, barely able to maintain 17 knots. Yet Commander Evans did not hesitate. He gave the order to turn his crippled ship and charge the 4 Japanese destroyers and the cruiser. This was not a tactical move. This was a suicide attack designed solely to draw the enemy fire and buy the carriers, now struggling to launch their last planes, the final minutes they needed. It was an act of pure sacrificial defense, the ultimate fulfillment of the promise he had made to his men that this would be a fighting ship until the last ounce of steam ran out. The remaining crew members, covered in soot and deafened by the constant explosions, did not question the order. They knew what it meant. They followed their commander into the breach, their last minutes spent firing into the advancing line of steel until their 5-inch barrels could shoot no more. The engagement that followed was an execution. The Haguro, armed with 8-inch guns, and the 4 Japanese destroyers, seeing the crippled, smoke-belching Johnston, converged on her with merciless efficiency. Evans maneuvered the ship with his last ounce of strength, firing his remaining 3 5-inch guns until the barrels glowed a cherry red. The small American shells, though unable to destroy the enemy, continued to inflict chaos, forcing the Japanese ships to maneuver slightly and further disorganize their pursuit of the carriers. One of the Japanese destroyers, the Hayashio, took a hit in the engine room from a lucky shot and lagged behind. But the rest of the Japanese formation ignored the damage and focused their combined fire on the Johnston. Shell after shell struck the American tin can. The bridge was hit again, killing many of the command crew. The remaining engine room was punctured, the steam pressure plummeting to 0. The Johnston was now a dead ship, burning fiercely, listing heavily to port, and drifting aimlessly in the sea of smoke and wreckage she had created. The thin hull plates had been ripped to shreds. The sea poured into the machine, fighting the flames, creating clouds of hissing steam that rose above the wreck like a final desperate prayer. The sounds of the battle had changed. The colossal roar of the Yamato's 18-inch guns was now replaced by the sharper, more immediate sound of medium-caliber ordnance, tearing the thin steel skin of the destroyer apart. The Japanese fire was concentrated, unforgiving, and relentless. The Johnston's life was being measured in seconds. Now, yet she continued to float a testament to the incredible internal damage control efforts of the surviving crewmen working in pitch-black flooded compartments, sealing off bulkheads, while shrapnel rained down on the decks above. But even the will of Commander Evans could not keep the ship alive forever. The United States ship Johnston was dead in the water. She was hit by 6 18-inch shells, more than 45-inch shells, and countless near misses that had warped and shredded her light structure. She had been fighting for 3 hours straight, a battle that should have lasted exactly 3 minutes. Commander Evans knew his ship was lost. At 9:45 hours on the morning of October the 25th, 1944, with the deck listing nearly 50 degrees and the main deck completely underwater, Evans gave the final command, "Abandon ship." He did not give the order lightly, waiting until he was absolutely certain that nothing more could be done. The surviving crew, many of them badly wounded, scrambled over the rails and into the oil-slicked, burning sea. They jumped into the warm, bloodied water, knowing that their fight was over, but that the carriers they had sworn to protect had been saved. The ocean floor was now visible through the holes in the hull, and the last sounds from the ship were the tortured creaks of the hull plating giving way to the sea. As the crew abandoned the sinking destroyer, the Japanese battle line, having broken through the pathetic American defenses, circled the wreck. A heavy cruiser passed within 500 yards of the sinking Johnston and deliberately opened fire, with its smaller anti-aircraft weapons riddling the Hulk with 50 caliber rounds, a final petty act of vengeance against the tin can that had embarrassed their fleet. At 10:10 hours, the United States ship Johnston rolled over and plunged stern first into the deep abyssal water, the weight of the water in her forward compartments pulling her down. She went down, fighting, disappearing beneath the waves, with her flag still flying. The sea was now dotted with hundreds of American sailors, survivors of the Johnston and other ships of Taffy III, floating in life jackets among the debris and the blood. Commander Evans himself was last seen on the fantail of his sinking ship, a man of 5 feet 8 inches of pure defiance, helping his injured men into life rafts. He was waving them off, telling them to go while he stayed with the dying machine. He was wearing his helmet and his Kapok life vest. He had sustained multiple injuries, including a deep chest wound. He refused to leave until the sea literally dragged the deck from under him. He was seen floating on a raft for a short time after the ship went down, his head bowed exhausted and broken. But the relentless tropical sun and the wounds he sustained were too much. Commander Ernest Evans was never seen again. He was one of nearly 190 crew members lost with the Johnston that day, including 86 men in the engine room and fire rooms alone, the unsung heroes who kept the steam pressure up until the very end. He died as he had lived, sacrificing everything for the men he commanded and the cause he served. The tactical outcome of that day was absolute. The incredible charge of the Johnston, followed by the equally furious fight put up by her sister ships and the escort carrier's tiny planes, had convinced Admiral Kurita that he was engaging the full power of the United States Navy's famed Third Fleet. The damage was real, the confusion was immense, and the audacity was beyond anything the Japanese doctrine allowed for. Faced with a seemingly endless wave of suicidal attacks, Kurita, believing he was about to be trapped by the mythical Third Fleet, made the stunning decision to break off the engagement and retreat. He turned his center force around, sailing away from the defenseless landing fleet and abandoning the most critical objective of the Japanese Empire's final grand offensive. The sacrifice of the Johnston and her commander had not been in vain. The lone tin can, insulted and mocked by the greatest battleship in history, had stopped the enemy cold. Evans's impossible charge had delivered the torpedo that crippled the Kumano, fired the rounds that blinded the Suzuya, and laid the smoke screen that saved the carriers. It was the desperate, unscripted valor of men like Evans that turned the tide of the entire battle. For his fearless leadership and his impossible gallantry, Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the United States Navy to receive the nation's highest military decoration. His citation simply states that his action was attacking the entire enemy force, an understatement that barely begins to describe the sheer, terrifying ferocity of his defiance. The Johnston lies somewhere on the ocean floor, more than 20,000 feet down a grave, deep enough to hold the weight of its legend, a tin can that fought like a capital ship and a man who did the impossible. His charge alone and unaided remains a blinding flash of courage in the dark history of war, a reminder that sometimes the smallest weapon guided by the greatest will can defeat the largest enemy. The mockers were silenced, not by armor or tonnage, but by a man who refused to be afraid of them.